Hello. This presentation is going to focus on the introduction of the research paper, and even though it's presented here first, often it is one of the last things that you write. This is to say that in order to present the introduction, you have to be very clear on your thesis, your research questions, what you've generally gained from your literature review, what methods you used and how they came about, and the recommendations you're eventually going to make. So essentially, this actually gets written after your conclusion, at least the draft of your conclusion is written. The abstract is probably the very final thing you will write for your paper, as it's the brief or synopsis. But that being said, the purpose of your introduction is to introduce the focus and background of your research. You need to state the problem and identify the context of the problem. That is, why it's a problem, how it became a problem, and explain the significance of your research briefly, identify your necessary terminology. I'll say something about that. It's very important to focus on the idea of your paper. You know who your audience is at this point, and introducing basic terminology that anyone in your field of study would recognize is not what the terminology is for. It is for terminology that maybe isn't necessarily familiar to your general audience, or that is so important in the way you're presenting it that you are taking some license with it and making sure that your understanding of the terminology and your reader's understanding of the terminology is the same, and that is the case in which you're going to use it. You need to make sure you define the intention of your research and understand the significance and purpose of it. State your research questions clearly and explain them, and state your thesis clearly and make sure that you are ready to prove it. The statement of your problem it's generally its own section. In the introduction, you've introduced briefly. Now you're going to state the problem, you're going to state it. The problem your thesis will address, explain why it's significant enough to warrant study, and offer a context. Think globally to locally, generally to specific, as we talked about writing the thesis before. This is, in general, who does it affect, and in specific, who are you focusing on? Then there's the background section of your introduction. You're going to briefly introduce the relevant contributors to your research, identify the types of research and studies that exist for your literature review, and note areas that require further study for your paper. Some instructors, the background seems to get confused with what the background of your literature review would be. So the background here at the beginning of your research paper focuses on your lit review and where you're going to go with your research. The background in your lit review will focus more on the history of your topic. The rationale behind your paper, briefly discuss the ideas or theories from the course of study that are relative to your thesis. Many instructors require this. Most research papers require some discussion of rationale, although you may include it in your introduction. It sort of depends on your instructor's requirements. Focusing on research questions. Often we see research questions and terms bulleted. This isn't the way they should be done. They should have their own headings, and you should not bullet or number them, but everything should be written in paragraph form underneath a heading. So you want to identify your research questions by discussing their importance and relevance to your thesis in a paragraph, and that is to say, why are they important questions to answer, and just go through your research questions and move on in paragraph form. Same with the definition of terms. Do not bullet or number, and do not source dictionary.com. Again, if you're directed to do so by your instructor, that's a different story, not dictionary.com necessarily, but bulleting or numbering. But the idea of your definition of terms is to introduce the reason for needing to define that term. Using scholarly sources, you would reference the source that you are using for your particular version of, say, mentoring. What specifically are you discussing? And explain the significance of it to your research and thesis. Methods. In the introduction of your paper, this is a paragraph or so. And it's required for primary research. You want to give a quick summary of what you intended to do and why. You'll further explain it in the actual methods section of your paper, but this is the methods section of your introduction only. And it's required for primary research, may or may not be required for your secondary research. base that on your instructor. And in this, you'll include a brief introduction of the research approaches that you use and a rationale for why you chose that particular approach. You'll explain the population and the data collection later in the actual methods section of your paper. You'll also briefly introduce the limitations of your study here. The introduction technically sort of ends up reading a bit like a summary, like an executive summary, where you're introducing all the pieces of your paper that you will later discuss. And finally, if you need help writing that introduction, I see the fewest problems with the introduction because it is so organized, but honestly, the majority of your paper is organized into very clear expectations. If you use these resources online and if you follow the questions, they're very specific and they're very typical to every research paper you will do, whether it's your capstone or whether it's something you did for a nursing or business class ahead of time where you were studying and analyzing case studies. The idea is to take your research, analyze it, and have something to say about it that is persuasive and well developed, and you're going to just simply introduce it in your introduction. So my recommendations, as usual, I like the USC guide as far as a very thorough way to learn it, to learn what is included and why. But the UNC Writing Center is very simple and straightforward. There's a ton of information online. Use it. I hope this is helpful. Good luck.